The grocery store was noisy with holiday shoppers when a small voice cut through the chatter. A little girl, dark-skinned, skinny from missed meals, stood at the counter clutching a carton of milk to her chest. Her eyes locked on the cashier, and with trembling lips she said, "Someday, when I'm grown, I'll find a way to pay you." The air froze. A child, offering a future promise in place of $1. Have you ever heard anything so raw, so desperate? What would you have done in that moment? Walk away or step forward? Drop your answer below, because this story doesn't end at the counter. What happened next shocked everyone, especially the man who would change her life. Her name was Emily Parker, 8 years old, hair braided neatly, though her coat was thin against the December chill in Brooklyn. She wasn't shopping for herself. She was fighting for her baby brother Noah, who had been crying for hours in the shelter where they sometimes slept. Emily had no money, no food stamps, no adult to speak for her, only courage and a plea that revealed just how much she'd already learned about hardship. Behind her, customers muttered. Some frowned in sympathy. Others rolled their eyes. The cashier, weary and impatient, snapped, "Sweetheart, this isn't a promise shop. No cash, no milk." And that should have been the end of it. Another quiet humiliation added to the growing list of struggles Emily already carried on her small shoulders. But not this time. Because standing in line 2 people back was Michael Hayes, a 45-year-old tech investor known on Wall Street, but nearly invisible in everyday life. He had built a fortune-owned condos across the country and could buy 1,000 cartons of milk without blinking. Yet, in that moment, all he saw was a child staring down an adult and losing. Something in her words, something about paying later, hit him harder than any deal or business failure ever had. Michael stepped forward. Without raising his voice, he laid a crisp bill on the counter and said, "Give her what she came for." The cashier hesitated, then slid the milk across the scanner. Emily looked up at him wide-eyed, unsure if this stranger was mocking her or saving her. When she realized it was the latter, her shoulders dropped in relief. She whispered, "Thank you," so quietly most people missed it. But Michael heard every syllable, and it went deeper than he expected. What Emily didn't know was that Michael had grown up in a small town where kindness was currency. His mother had worked 2 jobs. His father had left early. He remembered nights when neighbors quietly left groceries at their door. Looking at Emily was like looking back in time. The only difference was she wasn't getting that neighborly rescue until now. What Michael chose to do after paying for the milk would not just help her for a day. It would alter the course of her family's life in ways none of them could have imagined. Emily clutched the carton like it was gold. She started to leave, but Michael knelt down, meeting her eyes. "Where's your mom?" he asked gently. Emily hesitated. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze flicking toward the door as if escape was safer than answers. That hesitation told Michael everything. There was more here than just hunger. Shoppers turned back to their own errands, but Michael couldn't shake the image. A millionaire used to solving problems with money suddenly faced a problem that money alone couldn't fix. Emily didn't just need groceries. She needed someone to see her, to stand beside her, when the world had already looked away. Emily finally whispered, "She's not feeling well." "We stay close to the bridge." Then she turned quickly, afraid she had revealed too much. Michael felt his chest tighten. This wasn't a child playing poor for sympathy. This was survival stripped bare. He picked up his bag and followed, not to intrude, but because something inside him refused to let her vanish into the cold with nothing but milk and a promise. For viewers watching this story unfold, it's tempting to think children like Emily belong to someone else's problem, another city, another statistic. But what if she were your granddaughter, your neighbor's child, the girl you passed by yesterday? Would you still walk away? comment below because this question cuts deeper than a viral headline. It cuts into who we are as people. As Emily disappeared into the winter streets of Brooklyn, the city noise roared back, car horns, subway rumbles, impatient crowds. Yet Michael heard none of it. All he could hear was her fragile voice at the counter, pledging a future she shouldn't have had to promise. He didn't know it yet, but that moment was the start of a journey that would test every value he held, strip away his comfort and demand more of him than any boardroom ever had. And the path Emily led him down under a shadowed bridge into a world he had never dared to imagine was where the real shock waited. Emily led the way, with the carton of milk pressed tightly against her chest, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Her shoes slapped against the cracked pavement too thin for the cold, while her little brother's cries echoed faintly from somewhere ahead. Michael Hayes followed a few steps behind his tailored coat, a sharp contrast to the frayed hood on Emily's back. He had expected her to head toward an apartment building, or maybe a rundown row house. Instead, she guided him under the shadow of the Brooklyn Bridge into a place he had only ever seen from the comfort of his car window. The air grew heavier as they descended into the concrete maze below. A mix of damp stone exhaust fumes and stale food clung to the space. Tents made from patched tarps leaned against the walls. Scattered shopping carts stuffed with bags and blankets marked the invisible borders of makeshift homes. It wasn't just one family hiding here, it was a community of the unseen. Michael's stomach tightened. He had read articles about New York's homelessness crisis, but numbers in a newspaper were nothing compared to watching an 8-year-old girl disappear into this underworld carrying a carton of milk. Emily stopped beside a faded blanket draped across 2 pillars. Behind it sat Noah, barely a year old, bundled in a jacket several sizes too large. His cheeks were chapped red from the wind. When he saw his sister, his cries softened into hiccups. Emily rushed to his side, pried open the carton with shaky hands, and poured some of the milk into a baby bottle that had long since lost its clarity. She handed it to him, her face glowing with relief, as though she had just solved the greatest problem in the world. That was when a woman stirred from the shadows. Laura Parker was 35, though hardship made her look older. Her hair was tangled, her eyes swollen from exhaustion. But there was something striking about the way she carried herself. She didn't look at Michael first. She looked at her children, scanning their faces as if to confirm they were still safe. Only then did she notice the well-dressed stranger standing uncomfortably in the corner. "Emily, who is this?" Her voice was hoarse, guarded. Emily glanced nervously at Michael. "He helped me, Mama. He paid for the milk." Laura's eyes narrowed. Gratitude flickered briefly, but it was drowned quickly by suspicion. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself as though shielding her children from more than just the cold. "We don't need pity," she muttered, her tone both proud and weary. Michael raised his hands, palms open, his voice steady. "I'm not here to pity you. I couldn't stand there and do nothing." Laura studied him, her eyes searching for the catch. People had walked by before. People had promised things before, and every time disappointment had cut deeper than hunger. "You've done enough," she said finally. "You can go now." But Michael didn't move. He watched Emily tuck Noah against her chest, rocking him gently, while humming a lullaby that seemed far too tender for a child to know. The image pierced through his defenses. This was not a situation that money alone could mend. It was about safety, dignity, and choices stripped away piece by piece. He couldn't simply walk back to his penthouse and forget what he had seen. He crouched down, lowering himself to their level. "Laura, right? I'm Michael. Look, I don't know your story, but I know no child should have to beg for milk. Please let me help." For a moment, Laura's face softened. She wanted to believe him. But the bruises of her past, the broken marriage, The eviction noticed the endless nights on the streets rose like a wall. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. She turned away, her voice low but firm. Help has strings. I can't let my kids pay that price. Emily looked up, her small voice cracking. Mama, he's different. He didn't laugh at me. He didn't call me a thief. Her plea was simple, but it hung in the air, heavier than any argument Michael could have made. Michael felt the weight of Emily's words. He pulled a folded blanket from one of the abandoned carts nearby and draped it gently over Noah. He didn't say much, just enough. This one's free. No strings, just warmth. The silence stretched. Finally, Laura let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging as if the fight had drained out of her. She didn't say thank you, but she didn't push him away either. And in that fragile space between rejection and acceptance, Michael saw a chance not just to provide, but to prove that kindness could be real. What he didn't realize was that this first night under the bridge would be the beginning of a test, not of his wealth, but of his persistence. Because by morning Laura would vanish, leaving Michael with a choice he never thought he'd have to make. The night dragged on, cold seeping through the thin blankets. Michael stayed longer than he planned, sitting on a concrete step nearby, watching the city lights flicker above while the children finally drifted to sleep. Every horn, every rumble of the subway reminded him that life was moving fast for everyone else, while here beneath the bridge time seemed frozen in survival. He thought about the millions he had invested, the boardrooms where decisions were made, and how none of it compared to the decision now pressing against his chest: walk away or step in deeper. Laura lay awake, staring at him through the dim light. She wondered why this man hadn't left, why he hadn't dismissed her with the same casual indifference most strangers carried. Part of her longed to ask for help. Another part feared that leaning on anyone would only end in betrayal. But as she listened to Noah's steady breathing and Emily's soft murmurs in her sleep, she admitted to herself that maybe, just maybe, this man had come for a reason. Michael didn't try to force a conversation. Instead, he whispered a quiet promise into the night, more to himself than to anyone else. I'm not walking away, not this time. The city above roared on, but under the bridge, 3 lives and one unlikely stranger were bound together by a carton of milk, a fragile trust, and the possibility of something greater than survival. And though Laura didn't know it yet, the choice she made in the coming hours would determine whether that possibility became a future or faded back into the shadows. The morning sun slipped through the cracks of the Brooklyn Bridge, lighting up the damp ground where Michael Hayes had sat all night. He looked over to the blanket where Laura Parker and her children had been huddled, only to find it empty. Emily and Noah were still there, startled and confused, but Laura was gone. The realization hit him like a punch. She had vanished without a trace. Michael tried to stay calm for the children, but inside panic surged. He had seen enough to know Laura was struggling with more than poverty. Fear, pride, and desperation had driven her to disappear. He couldn't shake the thought that she might not come back at all. Emily clutched Noah and asked the question he dreaded. "Where's Mama?" Michael didn't have an answer, but he knew he couldn't let the kids slip through the cracks of the system. He brought Emily and Noah to a modest hotel in downtown Brooklyn, checking them into a suite with 2 beds. The contrast was jarring: clean sheets, warm light, and running water. Emily's eyes darted nervously around the room, unused to comfort. Noah curled into the pillow and fell asleep almost instantly. Michael stood at the window, staring out at the city. He had a choice: let this family go, or step further into their lives. Something deep inside told him the choice had already been made. By the next evening, when Laura still hadn't returned, Michael took action. He called contacts, searched records, and even hired a private investigator. Nothing turned up. That's when he decided to expand the search. He flew Emily and Noah with him to Los Angeles, where shelters and outreach centers were known to serve thousands like Laura. It wasn't random. An old acquaintance had mentioned Laura once lived there, and Michael trusted his instinct. Los Angeles was a different world. Sun-drenched streets, endless sprawl, and a homelessness crisis visible at every corner. The city's beauty collided with the harsh reality of tents lining sidewalks and encampments under freeways. Michael, who usually traveled in private cars and boardroom circles, now walked through areas most people avoided. Emily clung to his hand, Noah strapped against his chest in a borrowed carrier. He stopped at mission kitchens, asked volunteers, showed Laura's picture to outreach workers. Some shook their heads, others said they thought they had seen her, but the trail always went cold. One night, Michael wandered into Echo Park, a place he had only ever known through news reports about cleanups and protests. Lanterns flickered inside tents. The sound of radios and muffled conversations filled the air. He approached carefully, aware that strangers were not always welcome. Emily's eyes widened as she whispered, "Mama used to bring us near here." It was the first real lead. A woman in a denim jacket sitting near the lake recognized the photo. "Yeah, I saw her a few nights ago. You looked lost, carrying a bag that wasn't hers." She didn't stay long. Michael pressed for more, but the woman just shook her head. "She's running from something." People like that don't stay put. The words stung. Laura wasn't just homeless, she was adrift, slipping further from the children who needed her. Michael sat on a park bench, staring at the lake reflecting the city lights. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing harder each day. He could write a check to rebuild a school, but he couldn't write one to guarantee a mother would come back. Still, he refused to stop. He printed flyers with Laura's picture, offered rewards, and met with outreach coordinators. Emily, quiet but determined, helped pass the flyers out. "If Mama sees this, maybe she'll know we're looking," she said, her voice hopeful but uncertain. Noah babbled in her arms, too young to understand the urgency, but his presence reminded Michael why he couldn't quit. Days blurred into nights. Michael's phone buzzed constantly with tips, most of them dead ends. But one morning, an outreach worker called. A woman matching Laura's description had been seen near a community clinic on the east side of the city. Michael rushed there with Emily and Noah. They arrived too late. Laura had already left. But on a bulletin board outside, tucked between flyers for free meals and job training, was a scrap of paper that made Michael's heart pound. It was a handwritten note, barely legible. "If anyone finds my kids, tell them I'm sorry. I'll come back when I can," signed only with the letter L. Emily recognized the handwriting instantly. She pressed the note against her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's Mama," she whispered. Michael swallowed hard, relief mixed with dread. Laura was alive, but she was slipping further into a life that could swallow her whole. That scrap of paper was both a promise and a warning, and it set Michael on a course that would test how far he was willing to go to keep two children safe while searching for a mother who might not want to be found. The days that followed pushed Michael further than he ever expected. He walked streets lined with tents, spoke to people hardened by years outside the system, and learned quickly that survival came at a steep cost. He saw mothers with eyes like Laura's carrying children through the chaos, and it haunted him. He thought about Emily's strength, about the way she had stood at that grocery store counter. She deserved stability, safety, a chance to be a child again. Michael knew he couldn't replace their mother. But as he held Noah in one arm and guided Emily with the other, he realized he couldn't let them go either. Every mile they walked through Los Angeles. Every flyer he posted, every dead end they hit, only deepened his resolve. This wasn't about charity anymore. It was about commitment. By the time the sun set over the Pacific, Michael Hayes, a man used to negotiating mergers and acquisitions, found himself negotiating with hope itself. Somewhere in this sprawling city, Laura Parker was lost. But Emily and Noah were not, and he would fight with everything he had to keep it that way. The question hanging over Michael's head wasn't just if he could find Laura. It was what would happen if he did. Would she accept help or run again? That uncertainty was the shadow that followed them through every street in Los Angeles. When Michael Hayes finally found Laura Parker again, she was thinner, weaker, and carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been running too long. The reunion was not dramatic. There were no sweeping embraces or perfect words. Laura stood frozen on a Los Angeles sidewalk as Emily clung to her waist, and Noah squealed at the sound of her voice. She looked at Michael with eyes that carried both gratitude and suspicion. He didn't press her for explanations. He simply said, "Come with me. Just for now." For Laura, stepping into Michael's world was like stepping onto another planet. Within a day, she and her children were flown to Chicago, where Michael kept a penthouse on the top floor of a glass tower overlooking the river. The elevator ride alone made Emily gasp. She had never been that high above the ground, and she pressed her face to the glass as the city unfolded beneath her. Noah laughed at the swishing sound of the doors. Even Laura, hardened by struggle, couldn't hide the wonder in her eyes when she stepped into a home that smelled of fresh flowers and polished wood. The contrast was staggering. Just nights earlier, they had been sleeping under a bridge, every sound a possible threat. Now, Emily had her own bed, with sheets soft as clouds, and Noah had a nursery stocked with toys and formula. Laura stood at the edge of it all, overwhelmed. "This is too much," she whispered. Michael shook his head. "No, this is what you and your children deserve. Safety. Dignity." The first meal they shared together was simple grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, but it felt extraordinary. Emily giggled as she dipped her sandwich. Noah smeared soup across his cheek, and Laura ate slowly, as if trying to remember what it felt like to be nourished without worry. Michael didn't talk about business or money. He asked about their favorite colors, what Emily wanted to be when she grew up, what lullabies Laura used to sing when the kids were smaller. He wasn't building a case to win their trust. He was simply trying to give them back their voices. Trust, however, did not come easily. At night, Laura would sit on the balcony, staring at the glittering skyline, her mind restless. She was grateful, but also uneasy. She knew what people thought of women like her: broken, irresponsible, undeserving. She feared that by accepting help she was proving them right. But then she would hear Emily's laughter echo through the hallways, or Noah babbling happily as he played, and the fear would soften. Michael understood that healing wasn't just about shelter. It was about rebuilding identity. He reached out to a trusted therapist who specialized in trauma-arranging sessions for Laura at a clinic nearby. At first, she resisted. "I don't need to talk about the past," she insisted. But the counselor's gentle approach helped her face the truth. She had buried the abusive marriage, the eviction, the spiral into survival mode. Slowly, Laura began to see that her story didn't have to end in shame. Emily flourished in the penthouse. She discovered the joy of drawing with real pencils and paper, of reading books that weren't torn and stained. She even begged Michael to let her start school again. Within weeks, she was enrolled at a neighborhood elementary school, walking through the doors with a backpack twice her size and a nervous smile. On the first day, she told her teacher, "I want to learn fast so I can help my mom." Those words echoed in Michael's mind long after. Noah, still too young for school, thrived in the stability. He took his first real steps across Michael's living room floor, stumbling into Emily's arms as she squealed with pride. Laura cried quietly in the corner, watching her children reclaim pieces of childhood that had been stolen by the streets. But not everything was easy. Laura wrestled with guilt. She worried that her presence in Michael's home was an intrusion, that She was just another responsibility on his long list. Michael confronted her doubts directly. "Laura," he said, one evening, "you're not a burden. You're a mother doing everything you can. Don't confuse hardship with failure. They are not the same thing." Just as Laura started to believe in the stability surrounding her, a shadow from her past came knocking, reminding her that healing was never a straight line. It happened one evening when the doorman called Michael upstairs. A man had appeared in the lobby demanding to see Laura. His name was Mark Johnson, her ex-husband, the father who had abandoned his family. His presence was like ice in her veins. She had run from him once, and now here he was, threatening the fragile safety she had found. Michael stepped in immediately, instructing building security not to allow Mark inside. But the encounter rattled Laura deeply. She feared losing her children to the very man who had once left them hungry. That night she barely slept, clutching Noah close, while Emily whispered, "Mama, he can't take us. Michael won't let him." The next morning, Michael sat with Laura at the kitchen table. "We'll handle this the right way," he said firmly. "You don't have to face him alone anymore." For the first time, Laura allowed herself to believe those words. The penthouse became more than just a shelter. It became a bridge between survival and possibility. Michael introduced Laura to a nonprofit that helped women transition back into the workforce. They paired her with a mentor, a woman who had once been homeless herself, but now managed a community program. For the first time in years, Laura filled out a job application. Her hands trembled, but when Emily hugged her afterward and said, "I'm proud of you," "Mama," the tremor faded. Michael also encouraged Laura to share her story in small circles at the community center. At first, she spoke quietly, barely lifting her eyes. But the more she talked, the more she realized her voice carried power. Other women leaned in nodding, crying, finding courage in her honesty. What had once been a source of shame was becoming a tool of hope. By the end of that first month in Chicago, the transformation was visible. Emily walked taller. Noah laughed louder, and Laura's face carried light that had been missing for years. It wasn't a fairy tale. There were still hard days, still doubts, but there was direction, purpose, and community. And that Michael realized was more valuable than any luxury he could provide. The fragile balance of their new life would soon be tested again, but this time Laura would not face the storm as the woman she once was. She was changing, becoming stronger, more resilient, and ready to fight for her children's future in ways she had never dared before. The confrontation with Mark Johnson changed everything. His sudden appearance in Chicago reminded Laura Parker how fragile her new stability really was. But it also revealed something deeper. She was no longer the same woman who had once cowered under the weight of his control. With Michael Hayes standing firmly beside her, Laura found the courage to take legal steps she had once thought impossible. Within weeks, she worked with an attorney to file for full custody backed by testimony and evidence of abandonment. For the first time in years, she felt the system was on her side. Mark's threats did not vanish overnight, but the court's restraining order gave her and her children breathing room. Laura knew she couldn't heal completely in the shadows of her past. Chicago had been a place of safety, but she needed a true restart, a city where her story could grow into something more than survival. That opportunity came when a nonprofit in San Francisco invited her to join their leadership training program. They wanted her voice, her experience, her fire. After long discussions with Michael and her children, Laura made the decision. They packed their things and flew west, not as a family still running, but as a family ready to build. San Francisco greeted them with its sweeping bay views and winding streets. Emily pressed her nose against the car window as they crossed the Golden Gate Bridge, whispering, "It looks like a painting." Noah clapped his hands at the sight of the water glittering in the sun. Laura sat quietly, holding both their hands, wondering if this was what hope was supposed to feel like, Not just relief from suffering, but the anticipation of something new. Their new home was modest compared to Michael's penthouse, a two-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood near the Mission District. The backyard was small, but it had a tree just tall enough for Emily to climb, and a patch of grass where Noah could run. Laura stood in the doorway, tears welling in her eyes. "It's ours," she whispered. For years, she had felt like a ghost drifting from shelter to shelter. Now she had keys, a mailbox, a space to call her own. Michael remained in their lives, but his role shifted. He wasn't the rescuer anymore. He was a mentor, a supporter, someone who believed in Laura's ability to stand on her own. "This is about restoration, not charity," he told her as he handed over the lease in her name. "Your children need to see that you did this." Laura nodded, understanding the weight of his words. Life in San Francisco wasn't perfect, but it was alive with possibility. Laura threw herself into the nonprofits program, learning about community outreach, advocacy, and public speaking. At first, she shook when she stood in front of a room, her voice cracking with nerves. But then she remembered the nights under the bridge, Emily's trembling voice at the grocery store, the countless women she had met who carried the same shame and silence. She spoke for them. She spoke for herself. And slowly, her voice grew steady, powerful, undeniable. Emily enrolled at a local elementary school and quickly became known for her resilience and bright spirit. She wrote an essay about the word home that made her teacher cry. "Home is where my mom doesn't have to hide," she wrote. Noah, still a toddler, ran through the hallways of their little house, his laughter bouncing off the walls. Laura often sat at the kitchen table, watching them, overwhelmed by gratitude for ordinary moments she once thought impossible. But the most remarkable transformation wasn't in the walls of their house or the safety of their neighborhood. It was in Laura herself, how she began to turn pain into power and loss into leadership. Within months, Laura became a familiar face in San Francisco's advocacy circles. She joined panels on homelessness, speaking not as a statistic but as a survivor. She helped design workshops for women leaving shelters, teaching them how to navigate job applications, childcare, and legal aid. Her story traveled farther than she ever expected. A local news station interviewed her, framing her as the mother who turned a promise into a future. Michael watched from the sidelines with quiet pride. He hadn't just provided resources, he had witnessed a rebirth, and Laura never let the children forget where they had come from. Every weekend, she wrote letters with Emily documenting their journey. Some letters were to the past messages, to the frightened version of herself who thought she couldn't escape. Others were to the future, addressed to Emily and Noah when they would be old enough to fully understand. Then came the night Laura stood before a packed auditorium at a community fundraiser. She looked out at the crowd lights blinding her eyes and began. "Once I believed my children's future ended under a bridge in New York. I believed my failures defined them. But someone believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And I chose to fight. I'm here to tell you, we don't need saviors, we need second chances." The room erupted in applause. Emily sat in the front row, clapping until her hands hurt her face, glowing with pride. By the end of that year, Laura was hired as a program coordinator for the nonprofit that had once lifted her up. She had a salary, health insurance, and a purpose larger than herself. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was shaping the path for others. As the sun set one evening, painting the San Francisco sky in shades of orange and gold, Laura stood on her porch watching Emily chase Noah across the yard. She thought about the bridge in Brooklyn, the carton of milk, the stranger who had stepped forward when no one else did. One act of kindness had started it all, but it was choice after choice, day after day, that had carried them here. She whispered to herself, "We're not broken anymore. We're beginning." And for anyone listening to this story, the message is clear. One small act of compassion can rewrite an entire future. Share this story right now because someone you know may be waiting for proof that hope still exists. From the very first moment in that grocery store when little Emily stood trembling with a baby brother in her arms, her story stopped being just about survival. It became about courage. A frightened girl asked for something as simple as milk, and in that moment she opened a doorway that would lead her family out of darkness. What began under the shadow of a bridge in New York stretched across cities through uncertainty, heartbreak, and risk, until it blossomed into new beginnings in San Francisco. Laura, once unseen and unheard, learned that being broken was not the end of her story. She transformed her scars into strength, her silence into a voice that carried hope for countless others. From the nights of shivering under concrete overpasses to the mornings of brewing coffee in her own kitchen, she walked a path that taught her one essential truth: no one is defined by where they start. Emily and Noah were no longer children of the streets. They became children of resilience, growing up in a home filled with warmth, laughter, and a future their mother had fought to give them. Michael Hayes, the millionaire who could have walked away, discovered that wealth wasn't measured in stock portfolios or square footage, but in the courage to step into someone else's struggle. His role was never to rescue, but to remind Laura that she was never invisible, that she had the strength to rise if only someone believed in her. His choice to stand by her side without expectation planted the seeds of restoration, not charity. And perhaps that's the greatest twist of all this story was never only about a family in need or a man with resources. It was about how compassion, when acted upon, can become the bridge between despair and renewal. It's about how ordinary people carrying extraordinary pain can still choose to fight for dignity, for home, for love. The lesson here reaches far beyond Laura's journey. We live in a world where brokenness often hides in plain sight under bridges, in shelters in the quiet exhaustion of single mothers, in the restless eyes of children who have seen too much. What this story teaches us is that healing doesn't always begin with grand solutions. Sometimes it begins with a simple act, a stranger choosing not to look away, a hand extended, a voice saying, "You matter." For each of us watching today, the invitation is the same. We may not all be millionaires, but every one of us has the power to show up, to listen, to help someone carry their load. And in doing so, we remind ourselves that humanity is not measured by what we keep, but by what we give. Ask yourself, whose story could you change with a single act of kindness? Who around you might be waiting for proof that hope still exists? If Laura's journey has moved you, let it be a reminder that your story, too, is still being written. No matter the pain, no matter the past, there is always a way forward. Healing redemption, second chances, they aren't reserved for the lucky few. They belong to anyone who dares to believe that tomorrow can be different from today. And if this story touched your heart, don't let it stop here. Share it, talk about it, and most importantly, join us by subscribing to this channel. Your support is what gives us the strength to bring more stories of resilience, courage, and hope to life. Click subscribe, leave a comment about where you're watching from, and let's build a community that chooses compassion every single day. Because together, we can keep telling stories that remind the world hope is never lost.